Imagine for a moment that the man who became the ultimate symbol of the First Crusade had, just a few years prior, been fighting against the Pope himself? All of Europe knew Godfrey of Bouillon as one of the wealthiest and most powerful dukes of his time, a warrior to the marrow of his bones, a loyal vassal of the German emperor. It was by his hand that the emperor stormed Rome, driving out Pope Gregory VII. Yet, a mere 10 years later, that same papacy, in the person of Pope Urban II, called for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. And Godfrey answered. But he didn't just answer. The Duke did the unthinkable. He sold everything he owned: castles, lands, titles. This powerful feudal lord converted his entire fortune into silver to equip an army and march to the ends of the earth on a pilgrimage from which he would, in all likelihood, never return. Everyone knows him as the first king of Jerusalem, but that is the greatest lie surrounding his name. He never wore the crown. Moreover, he demonstratively refused it when power fell right into his hands. History tells the story of the Crusades' most enigmatic leader, a man full of paradoxes. Today, we find out what compelled him, an enemy of the Pope, to become the primary executor of his will. Why did he, unlike the other leaders, sell absolutely everything, effectively burning his bridges behind him? How exactly did he manage to be the first to breach the walls of Jerusalem on that fateful day of July 15, 1099? And what actually happened in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre when he was offered dominion over the Holy City? This isn't just a biography of a knight. This is a psychological portrait of a man who sought not power, but redemption. He set out on the campaign a sinner, yet remained in history as a saint. And his greatest choice, the refusal of the crown, became not merely an act of humility. It turned into a political decision that defined the entire future destiny of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So, the year is 1095. Pope Urban II delivers his fiery speech in Clermont. His cry, "God wills it," spreads across Europe like wildfire. For the majority of feudal lords, these words sounded like a call to opportunity. Younger sons, like Bohemond, saw a chance to carve out lands for themselves. Kings found a way to get rid of troublesome vassals. Even the Pope, beyond spiritual goals, was solving political problems. And amidst this cynical calculation stood Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. He likely saw this as the last chance for redemption. His reputation was stained. This was the very knight who 10 years earlier marched in the vanguard of Emperor Henry IV's army, stormed Rome, and drove out Pope Gregory VII. Now, serving the enemy of the Pope, he carried a sin which he believed could only be washed away by the greatest of deeds. While other leaders, like Raymond of Toulouse or Bohemond of Toronto, haggled with the Pope, extracted preferences, and mortgaged parts of their holdings to raise an army, Godfrey made a decision that shocked everyone. A great sinner attempting to buy his forgiveness. But he decided not to pay with gold. He decided to pay with everything. And here is the first turning point. Godfrey doesn't just join the crusade, he finances it at the cost of his future in Europe. We transport ourselves to his domains. Across Europe, knights are feverishly seeking money. They're mortgaging castles, begging for a crusade tax from their peasants, plunging into debt. At this time in Lorraine, Godfrey, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, begins a total liquidation. He sells his primary ancestral castle, Bouillon, to the Bishop of Liège. This is not a mortgage. The deal is irreversible. He sells the county of Verdun. He liquidates everything. We are witnessing not just the signing of papers, we are seeing a man who owned thousands of hectares and dozens of fortresses, standing with bags of silver, ready to give them up for swords, chainmail, and provisions for the tens of thousands of souls who followed him. Let's break down the reasons for such an act. This is not the impulsive outburst of a fanatic, but the cold calculation of a pilgrim. Other leaders took their wives, children, and courtiers with them. They were traveling to relocate, hoping to found new principalities. Godfrey was traveling to die. He was burning his bridges. He had no need for lands in Europe because he did not plan to return. His goal was not Antioch or Edessa. He strove for Jerusalem. Sources describe him as a man of exceptional piety, but this was the piety of a warrior. He understood that an army marching on such a campaign could not depend on handouts from the Byzantine emperor or on pillaging. His army became the most disciplined, the best provisioned, and the most motivated, because their leader had already given everything he had. He turned his wealth from a burden that reminded him of his sins into a tool for their atonement. He marched to the Holy Land not as a conqueror, he marched as a pilgrim leading an army. And this subtle difference in motivation would determine everything that happened next. So, Godfrey, once the wealthiest duke, arrives at the walls of Constantinople, essentially as a man with nothing to lose but his own soul. His army is one of the largest and the best supplied. Herein lies the paradox. He found himself not alone. The crusade was an enterprise with no single commander. It was a tangle of 8 powerful, ambitious, and incredibly vain leaders, each of whom considered himself the chief. The army that gathered beneath the walls of Byzantium in 1097 resembled a powder keg, and the fuse was already smoldering. The first real test for Godfrey would not be the Turks. The first test would be his allies. And all of this would explode during one of the most agonizing and prolonged battles of the Middle Ages, the Battle for Antioch, a siege that lasted nearly 8 months and broke the will of thousands. It is here, in the mud, hunger, and in the face of betrayal, that Godfrey will have to make his second great choice: remain a holy pilgrim or become a ruthless politician to save the crusade from collapse. October 1097. The united Crusader army, intoxicated by early victories, approaches the walls of Antioch. They counted on another quick victory, that the walls would fall just as Nicaea had fallen. In reality, they had approached their mass grave. The siege of Antioch would last nearly 8 agonizing months. 8 months of famine, disease, and despair. This siege would become a melting pot that burned away everything superficial and revealed the true essence of each leader. And right here, Godfrey of Bouillon, the quiet and pious duke, would do what no one else could. We transport ourselves to the Crusader camp in the winter of 1097. All of Europe would have shuddered to see this. The Christian host, the greatest in a generation, was falling apart. Famine raged in the camp. Knights whose armor cost a fortune were devouring their own war horses that had died of exhaustion. Mass desertion began. Even Peter the Hermit, the inspirer of the crusade, tried to flee but was caught and returned in disgrace. And what are the leaders doing at this moment? They are fighting with each other. The adventurer Bohemond had already set his sights on this fortress city for himself. He was in open conflict with Raymond of Toulouse for the right to command. Each prince locked himself in his tent, guarding the remnants of provisions for his own men. The army ceased to be a unified whole, resembling a nest of spiders in a jar. It is at this moment that Godfrey of Bouillon makes his second choice. He could have, like Bohemond, hoarded his strength for the decisive assault to lay claim to the city. He could have, like his brother Baldwin, stepped aside. Instead, Godfrey opens his treasuries. Let's analyze the situation. Godfrey, unlike the others, no longer had lands in Europe generating income. The silver he carried with him was everything he had left, and he was spending this money, his last money, to feed not only his own soldiers, but warriors from other detachments as well. He personally walked through the camp, settling disputes. He prayed alongside common soldiers. Chroniclers note that while other princes were dividing the loot, Godfrey was dividing the burdens. If Bohemond acted as the strategist of this siege, then Godfrey was its conscience. Bohemond became the spear that pierced the wall, but Godfrey served as the shaft that prevented that spear from breaking under hunger and despondency during the 8 months prior to the strike. He held the crusade back from the brink of collapse with his personal reputation and his silver, the only leader who was still marching to Jerusalem, not for the crown of Antioch. So, June 3, 1098, Antioch is taken. But what happened turned out to be a trap. Scarcely had the Crusaders entered the city when a gigantic army led by the Emir Kerboga of Mosul approached the walls. The hunters turned into the prey. Now they, exhausted and starving, were locked inside a city full of corpses. The darkest hour of the entire crusade arrives. Despair was so total that one of the monks finds the holy lance in the ground, the very one that allegedly pierced Christ. A gesture of desperation, a last attempt to raise morale. And it worked. The Crusaders, on the brink of death, launch a suicidal sortie and miraculously smash Kerboga's army. Victory? No. The crusade is once again on the brink of collapse. Bohemond, as expected, claims his prize. He declares himself Prince of Antioch and refuses to go any further. Raymond of Toulouse furiously disputes his rights. The army is leaderless again. They sat in Antioch for another 6 months, arguing who would get what. Jerusalem, the main goal, was still just as far away. And then the common soldiers, tired of the prince's greed, began to revolt. They themselves started tearing down the walls of the captured cities, shouting that if the princes would not lead them to Jerusalem, they would go themselves. They needed a leader, not an adventurer like Bohemond, not a vain politician like Raymond. They needed someone who from the very beginning had walked towards only one goal. All eyes turned to Godfrey of Bouillon. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, the Crusader army, reduced from hundreds of thousands to a pitiful 12,000 warriors, finally saw it: Jerusalem. But this is not the finale, but the beginning of the most desperate trial. The city was defended by a Fatimid garrison that proved stronger than the entire Crusader army. They had impregnable walls, full stocks of food, and, most terrifying of all, control over every well in the vicinity. The Crusaders had nothing. They stood under the scorching sun of Palestine. They had no food, they had no water, and they had no siege engines. Surrounding the city for many kilometers was a scorched desert. The garrison had prudently destroyed all the timber. The moment of truth arrived. They had reached the goal, but now risked dying of thirst at its walls. And here occurs the third turning point, where Godfrey of Bouillon turns from a moral leader back into a ruthless and brilliant warrior. While the leaders argued about which side to attack from, Godfrey acted. All over Europe, knights stormed walls simply by leaning ladders against them. But the walls of Jerusalem were too high. Siege towers were needed. Godfrey and Raymond of Toulouse sent detachments deep into enemy territory in search of wood. Miraculously, a Genoese fleet arriving in Jaffa brought them not only supplies, but more importantly, engineers and carpenters. A race against time began. Under the scorching sun, suffering from thirst, chroniclers write that water had to be brought from 10 kilometers away, and it cost more than wine. The Crusaders built 2 gigantic wooden siege towers. Raymond built one on the south. Godfrey built the second on the north. But Godfrey understood what the others did not. The garrisons saw where they were building the towers, and was reinforcing exactly those sections of the walls. And on the night before the assault, Godfrey executes a military ruse that decided the outcome of the battle. He ordered his men to dismantle their gigantic siege tower in total silence and move it by hand hundreds of meters along the wall to a section that was considered the weakest, but which the defenders were barely guarding. It was titanic work, carried out in the dark, right under the enemy's nose. On July 14, 1099, the assault began. Raymond's tower on the south got stuck. The attack choked. All the defenders' attention was riveted on him, and at that moment, Godfrey's tower, appearing out of nowhere on the north, went on the attack. Let's look closely at this moment. It wasn't just an assault, it became the culmination of Godfrey's 3-year mission. He didn't just command, he, as the chroniclers write, personally stood on the top tier of this swaying wooden behemoth, showered with arrows and Greek fire. July 15, 1099, morning. His tower comes right up to the wall. The bridge is lowered. It was Godfrey of Bouillon, along with a few knights, who was the first to step onto the walls of Jerusalem. He opened the gates from the inside. The army poured into the city. A massacre began, which went into history as one of the bloodiest episodes of the Middle Ages. Godfrey, having fulfilled his vow, reached the goal. The crusade was over, but his personal story was only beginning. So, July 15, 1099, the city is taken. Mission accomplished. Blood flooded the streets of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, maddened by 3 years of rage and thirst for vengeance, spared no one. But when the dust settled, the leaders faced the main question, the fatal question that had been smoldering since the very beginning of the campaign. What next? They conquered the city, but who does it belong to now? To the Byzantine emperor to whom they swore an oath? To the Pope who sent them? Or to themselves? A ruler had to be chosen, someone to lead the new state surrounded by enemies, and immediately political bickering began. Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most influential of all, believed the throne belonged to him by right. The oldest and most powerful, he made no secret of it. But the knights and barons fought otherwise. They were tired of his arrogance and political games, which had nearly ruined the campaign in Antioch. They saw Godfrey ascend the wall first. They remembered how he spent his money to feed their soldiers. The army made the obvious choice. They offered the crown to Godfrey of Bouillon, and what he did in response shocked them far more than his storming of the wall. So July 22, 1099. Only a week has passed since the bloody assault. The leaders of the crusade gathered in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to decide the fate of the Holy Land. The fate was decided simply: who will rule? Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most influential Count of Provence, was certain the crown would go to him. Being the eldest and most powerful, he didn't hide this. But the knights and barons thought otherwise. They were tired of his arrogance and political games, which nearly destroyed the crusade at Antioch. They saw how Godfrey was the first to ascend the wall. They remembered how he spent his money to feed their soldiers. The army made the obvious choice. They offered the crown to Godfrey of Bouillon. And here occurs the fourth, most critical turning point, the moment that transformed Godfrey from a simple commander into a legend. He refused. But he didn't just say no, he did it demonstratively, turning his refusal into a political and spiritual statement that defined the essence of the new state. Chroniclers passed down his words, which immediately became canonical. He declared that he would never wear a crown of gold where his Savior wore a crown of thorns. Now let's delve into the psychology of this act. Simple humility? No. It was a brilliant political move, wrapped in piety. First, Godfrey understood that he, a vassal of the German emperor, could not simply accept a royal title. That would be tantamount to a challenge not only to his suzerain, but also to the Pope, who considered Jerusalem his patrimony. By accepting the crown, he would have instantly turned everyone against him. Second, he saw that the state they had created was incredibly vulnerable. It was surrounded by enemies. It needed not the dictatorship of one man, but the support of all knights. And third, he remained true to his original motivation. He came here not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He sold his lands not to gain new ones. He came for redemption. Instead of a royal crown, he accepted a humble title, Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. What did this mean in practice? For the entire Christian world, it was a signal Jerusalem is ruled not by an ambitious monarch, but a humble defender of the shrine. This instantly raised his authority above all other princes. For the barons of the Holy Land, it meant he would be first among equals, not an absolute monarch, which guaranteed their loyalty. And for Godfrey himself, it meant he remained pure. He achieved the goal, atoned for the sin of war against the Pope, and did not stain his soul with a new sin, the sin of pride. The disgraced Raymond of Toulouse, unable to bear his rival's triumph, left Jerusalem in a fury. Godfrey remained alone, with a handful of knights, to rule a ghost city. He reached the summit. He gained everything, but he had less than a year left to live. So, Godfrey of Bouillon, the advocate but not the king, reigns in Jerusalem. But the Fatimids from Egypt, who lost the city, had no intention of accepting defeat. They immediately gathered a new, gigantic army to throw the Franks into the sea. Just 3 weeks after refusing the crown, Godfrey had to become again what he had always been, a warrior. August 12, 1099, the Battle of Ascalon, the last great battle of the First Crusade. The Crusaders, inspired by their leader, soundly defeated the superior Egyptian army. The victory was complete. The Crusader state was saved. And now Godfrey can finally begin to govern. He rules for exactly 1 year. This year was filled not with triumph, but with an exhausting struggle for survival. He fought off attacks, built fortifications, and tried to populate the deserted city. And then, in July 1100, exactly a year after his triumph, he suddenly dies. His death was shrouded in mystery. Some sources speak of a disease contracted during the siege, others of a poisoned arrow. But his mission was accomplished. He laid the foundation, and now someone needed to build on that foundation.
Godfrey of Bouillon sold everything he owned to embark on the crusade, and was the first to ascend the walls of Jerusalem, fulfilling his oath. But the man who redeemed his sin and conquered a kingdom demonstratively refused its crown. And this revealed one truth: redemption is more important than power, and often turns out to be power in the eyes of the people. And if Godfrey was the defender who sacrificed, then the next hero was an adventurer who took. His name is Bohemond of Toronto. His story became the legend of how to deceive everyone to conquer an entire principality. Subscribe, hit that like button if his refusal of the crown stunned you. Comment below, saint or politician. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.